Hi folks. Well, for those who had hoped that the GOP would be the power to reduce deficits and the national debt in Washington, D.C., I have some bad news for you. It turns out that new numbers showed that the federal government accrued twice the debt in 2018 as it did in 2017, and there is no end in sight. But this begs a couple questions. First of all, what could be the effects of this problem on you and me, the civilians in the economy? And second of all, if the federal government is in such debt, they must be issuing debt instruments, bonds, treasuries to try to pay this off. Well, who's buying those things? Well, the answer is quite surprising. Greetings, folks. Yes, it's true. The federal debt and deficit monsters are growing under the GOP, despite what many had hoped they would do, which would be to balance the budget by reducing the size and scope of the government. In fact, Mike Maharrey writes for the 10th Amendment Center, quote, "The Republican Party of fiscal responsibility continues to rack up debt at a staggering rate. The U.S. Treasury plans to borrow another $425 billion in the final quarter of 2018, bringing the total borrowing for the year to $1.34 trillion, end quote. And by the way, this is twice the debt accumulated in 2017. In fact, Maharrey goes on to say that the GOP-led government closed out fiscal 2018 with the largest budget deficit since 2012. And as I mentioned, there is no end in sight for 2019. So, this prompts a number of questions. First of all, how does DC try to cover these deficits? Well, they can do it one of three or possibly a combination of three ways. The politicians could try to raise taxes, but at a certain point, taxpayers resist that and there are political ramifications for it.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
The second way is that the federal government could coin money according to the Constitution, but they long ago ceded the power to print money to the Federal Reserve, which just inflates the money supply. The third way is to issue debt instruments, bonds, treasuries, and promise to pay those back at a certain rate of return after a certain period of time. And it's on this that I want to focus, because it turns out that for quite a while, the Federal Reserve has been purchasing these things in what they call Operation Twist, which really is just circular. The Federal Reserve prints up a bunch of useless money, buys bonds from the federal government, bonds which the federal government uses to pay back what it owes for previous bonds, which it already owes to the Federal Reserve. So it's just a circle.
There is no beginning. There is no end. Because it's a circle.
And all it does is reduce the buying power of your money that is already out there by inflating the money supply. Okay, well, what happens if the Federal Reserve decides that it's not going to purchase as many of these as it has in the past? Well, that means that demand for the new bonds decreases, which means that the federal government has to do something in its promises. It has to promise higher rates of return and sell the bonds for lower prices. But that has an effect on everybody else in the marketplace who has already purchased the bonds that exist and decreases the value of those bonds, which in turn could cause a potential bond liquidation crisis in the economy.
Sell! I want you to get out there and sell, sell, sell! I want you to sell your socks off! I want you to sell it! It's all about sell!
And I'm not talking about a big sale on James Bond DVDs. So, if the Fed won't buy the bonds, and we have a potential bond liquidation crisis, and by the way, China and Russia are not buying the bonds the way they used to decades ago. Contrary to popular belief, they don't own the federal government the way many people think they do.
I love China.
They've dumped them because they realize they're worthless. Well, who's buying the bonds? Who could possibly buy these bonds to prop up this federal government that is in such debt? Well, Kimberly Amadeo has the answer for us at thebalance.com. Guess who buys the federal bonds? That's right. A third of them are purchased by federal agencies. Yes, the federal government gets its own agencies to buy federal government debt instruments, upon which the federal agencies rely to survive because, of course, they're in debt.
Because it's a circle.
Yeah, we heard about the circle.
Yes, we're familiar with shapes.
You see, the circle just continues. It's not the Federal Reserve that's part of the circle now. It's the federal government. And by the way, which agency buys the bulk of its own debt? That's right. You got it, retirees. The Social Security Administration. Ka-ching! Yes! They buy up the bulk of the federal Treasury notes that are purchased by federal agencies. And how do they do this? Well, since they don't have enough money to pay off current retirees and they have to rely on people who are already earning money and they're shoveling the money up to the older people, and we know that that's going to last for a real long time, they already are promising to pay themselves back with money that comes from future generations. It's just a giant pyramid scheme, and it's built on the backs of potential taxpayers.
Triangle has like a corner in the end. This one is a circle.
Okay, we get it.
Can you imagine a private business propping up its own debt by purchasing bonds that it issues? It's just an endless cycle. They're digging their own hole. But the person with the shovel is really the taxpayer, and they're not going to get anything back. Unbelievable. Incredible. It could only be through the force and power of government to control our lives that we could be in this situation. And these new numbers are, as disturbing as they are, an opportunity for us to see where these purchases are going and see how they're propped up by a false idea that the government can facilitate its own debt by buying its own debt and paying itself back and then buying more of its own debt. Unbelievable. You are collateral as a worker. Land of the free. It is a powerful lesson, something to take with us. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we hope we've given you some intellectual ammunition to take with you outside of the computer world. For MRC-TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.